Quiet men had always been common in Montana, but Ethan Morgan was unique. Known solely as the seasoned old rancher who kept to himself, he had been working his Ironwood Valley ranch in almost complete silence for 15 years. His presence at Emma's restaurant every Sunday, sipping black coffee and reading his paper, had become second nature to the locals, who had never noticed how his perceptive eyes always sought ways out and points of view. Nobody knew why he had picked this specific plot of property with its ideal view of the valley's major approach, or about the twin colts he kept oiled and immaculate in his ranch house. All of that changed on the day the Phantom Reapers MC roared into Ironwood Valley, destroying the quiet of the morning with their chrome-plated Harleys. They were unaware that the silent rancher who was observing from the cafe window had been anticipating their arrival and had specifically picked this valley because guys just like them would soon arrive. They were going to find out what others had already learned too late, that the most deadly predator is sometimes the one you don't see approaching. Let's have a little rest. Please let us know where you are tuning in. Remember to subscribe if you enjoy this type of content, since tomorrow's story will be something very exceptional. In the dawn light, Emma Williams watched Morgan while cleaning her diner's counter. Even after serving him breakfast for 15 years, she was still unable to fully understand him. Sheriff Daniel Carter came in, took off his hat, and nodded to the regulars as the bell above the entrance chimed. "Good morning, Emma. Is Morgan causing you any problems?" Carter's amused eyes wrinkled. "Are you still awaiting more than 3 words from him?" As she poured the sheriff's typical cup of coffee, Emma answered. Emma had noted how Morgan's shoulders stiffened slightly at the sound of approaching motorcyclists, but he seemed to be unaware of their conversation as he changed a page of his newspaper, which rustled. 5 Harleys rolled into the lot, drowning out the diner's conversations as the rumbling grew louder. The Phantom Reapers MC's colors, leather cuts with a skull wearing a crown, were worn by their riders. "Problem?" Silently, Emma inquired. Carter gave a headshake. "Not quite yet. They said they were just passing through. Inquired about motel room rates and nearby companies. Dr. Bennett said from his booth, they've been asking about more than that. I've already visited my clinic twice to inquire about the delivery of pharmaceuticals." Carefully folding his paper, Morgan placed a $5 bill under his coffee cup. One of the motorcyclists, identified by the patches on his cut as Michael Razor Sterling, came into the diner as he stood. With the automatic awareness of a predator spotting another, Sterling's gaze roamed across the room before focusing on Morgan. Morgan took leisurely steps toward the door. With a tinge of challenge in his voice, Sterling yelled out, "Excuse me, old-timer. That lovely plot of land you have up on the ridge caught my attention." Morgan stopped, facing away from Sterling. There was utter silence in the diner. Sterling added that he had been considering opening a chapter house in the valley. "It would be ideal in your place. May want to extend an offer to you." Morgan swiveled just enough to look Sterling in the eye. His voice was as quiet as falling snow when he spoke. "Not available for purchase." He began to move once more, but Sterling blocked his way. "Perhaps you ought to consider it. Given the current state of cattle prices, this might be your best bet." Emma observed Morgan's hand movements. Even though they had not approached a weapon, there was something about their silence that made her breath catch. "The best course of action would be for you to move aside," Morgan said softly again. Morgan was on the move, but Sterling's hand fumbled for his jacket. Nobody saw what transpired next. With his arm twisted at an angle that caused him to gasp, Sterling just found himself staring at the ceiling. Morgan let him go and left, leaving the diner in stunned quiet with Sterling on the floor. They watched through the window as he got on his horse and rode off, his movements as serene as though nothing had occurred. From next to Carter, Deputy Turner murmured, "Jesus. What was that?" Carter looked at Morgan's slipping form. "That was our first hint of anything intriguing, son." Outside, Sterling was assisted to his feet by the other Phantom Reapers. Anger and wounded pride hardened their faces, but suddenly their eyes held something else. fear and uncertainty. That night, Morgan watched the sun set behind the mountains from his veranda back at his ranch. Below, he could see Ironwood Valley's lights, which were currently serene. His phone, an outdated flip phone that was purposefully simple, buzzed. It was a straightforward text. "They're present." Morgan stepped inside after deleting the message. He unlocked a concealed panel behind his desk in his study, exposing a wall of paperwork, maps, and surveillance images. The Phantom Reaper's itineraries, contacts, and operations throughout 3 states were conspicuously shown. He had been waiting for them to extend their area this far north for 15 years, during which time he had constructed this cover and selected this valley. Now that they had arrived, Ethan, also known as Silent Storm Morgan, was going to remind them why some legends should not be disturbed. While in town, Sterling talked on his phone while tending to his damaged arm and ego at the neighborhood pub. "Master?" "Yes. This might be an issue. You inquired about that rancher. He is distinct. This may need to be handled carefully." The phone crackled with Dominic the Shadow Romano's voice. "How is it different?" "Like someone who has witnessed significant action, such as law enforcement or the military. His movements." "Interesting," Romano said. "Don't move just yet, but keep an eye on him. Personally, I'm going out there. A few techniques from an old-timer won't halt the inevitable." Unaware that his talk had been overheard, Sterling hung up. Closing her general shop across the street, Emma Richardson had witnessed it all. She headed to Emma's diner, where a number of the town's residents had congregated. Emma said, "They're calling in their leader." They were uneasy about Morgan for some reason. Emma glanced at the worried expressions around the table. That might not be such a horrible thing. The way they've been threatening people, asking questions, and pushing into town. Dr. Bennett interrupted, asking what would happen if they pushed back. "What role does Morgan play in all of this?" Sheriff Carter got up and adjusted his belt. "I suppose we will soon find out. However, it seems to me that this community might be in dire need of our peaceful rancher at this very moment." As darkness descended in Ironwood Valley, preparations were being made for a battle that would rock the entire area. While Dominic Romano was in a motel room 30 miles away, studying satellite photographs of the valley and preparing his next move, Morgan was cleaning his firearms with practiced efficiency. There was a quiet before the storm, and when it broke, long-buried secrets would be revealed. Whatever tranquility Ironwood Valley had experienced came to an end in the morning when a caravan of black SUVs and motorcyclists rolled into the area. Sitting in the front automobile, Dominic the Shadow Romano's scarred visage peered at the scenery with calculating eyes. As they formed an escort around their leader's car, the patches of the Phantom Reapers gleamed in the morning sun. Emma Richardson stood in the front window at the general shop, watching the parade. "Get on the phone tree, Mary," she said to her assistant. "Everyone must be aware of their presence." Until it arrived at Emma's diner, the caravan continued on. With the smooth elegance of a predator, Romano stepped out of his SUV, his silver hair slicked back and his leather immaculately cut. Michael Sterling rushed beside him, whispering something and pointing to Morgan's ranch that could be seen on the far ridge. As Romano walked up to the counter inside the diner, Emma maintained a neutral expression. He spoke with the proprietor and remarked, "Coffee black," with a tone that carried a hint of power. Emma poured his coffee without looking into his eyes and said, "You're talking to her." "You have a lovely property here," Romano said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "It would be a shame if it were to die." The bell above the door chimed before Emma could answer. With his boots soundless on the wood floor, Ethan Morgan entered. The diner, apparently unaware of Romano's presence, grew silent as he walked to his normal booth. Romano turned to him and yelled, "Mr. Morgan. Interesting things have been told to me about you." Morgan took a seat and carefully unfolded his newspaper. "Not much to hear." With coffee in hand, Romano walked over to Morgan's booth. He moved into the seat across from her without being invited. "See, you're mistaken there. A man purchases a strategically located piece of land, lives alone for 15 years, and treats himself in the same manner that you treated my lieutenant. It's worth hearing that story." Morgan raised his head from his paper and met Romano's eyes. Neither man said anything for a long time. The dining became so tense that it was painful. Morgan finally whispered, "Your coffee's getting cold," in a quiet voice that reverberated around the room. Romano grinned menacingly. "I checked a little after Sterling's, you know. Incident. The interesting thing about records is that sometimes they reveal more about what is absent than what is present. You have a very sparse history prior to Ironwood Valley. Do you want me to make it fatter for you? It won't be required. I'm a businessman, you see. I have plans for this valley that might be advantageous to all. Morganation is all I need." Romano bent over. "Your land is ideal for our needs. Decide on a price." Morgan gently folded his paper. "Did it already. Not available for purchase. Everything is up for sale." Romano's tone became stern. "The question is whether or not the seller is satisfied when they leave." Morgan dropped his customary $5 on the table and stood up. He stopped when he went past Romano. "You have it reversed," he said. "The buyer's ability to walk away or lack thereof is the question." As Morgan walked away, the danger lingered. Anger colored Romano's face, but his expression was not only angry. Recognition. Something worrisome had caught his attention in Morgan's gaze. Sheriff Carter was standing behind his patrol cruiser outside. As Morgan went by, he remarked, "That was quite a display of force." Morgan mounted his horse and said, "It's going to get worse. Maybe it's time you told me what's really going on here." Morgan took a time to examine the sheriff. "Keep your deputy near, but it's best you don't know yet. A storm is on its way." Romano was already on his phone when he returned inside. "Rerun everything. Federal databases, law enforcement, and military records. Who are we working with, please?" Emma Richardson was having her own epiphany at the general shop. She had documented all significant transactions over her 40 years in Ironwood Valley. She had always been troubled by something about Morgan's land purchase. Examining the old deed records with new eyes, she took them out. She called Mary. "Please bring me the old maps from the county surveyor's office." The Phantom Reapers started to make their appearance as the morning wore on into the afternoon. Bicycle patrols were conducted by pairs of riders who noted the locations of surveillance cameras and committed layouts to memory. They focused especially on the roads to Morgan's ranch, the bank, and the police station. As he watched from the window of his clinic, Dr. Bennett called an old FBI friend. The call immediately ended up in voicemail. "It's Michael Bennett, Jim. Do you recall the favor you owe me? It's time to make the payment. In addition to looking into Ethan Morgan, you'll need all the information you can discover about a Dominic Romano and the Phantom Reapers MC. The numbers don't add up." Morgan used binoculars to observe the valley at his ranch. Romano had to admit that his men were professional. They were putting up observation posts that looked like camping areas in order to create a perimeter. However, they had not yet located his cameras, which he had placed at key locations across the valley for 15 years. The feeds from these covert cameras, which recorded faces, license plates, and conversations, were visible on his protected laptop. It was the culmination of 15 years of patience. Unaware that they were entering a trap that had been waiting for them since before they even knew this valley existed, the Phantom Reapers believed they were setting one. For the first time in 20 years, Emma closed her diner early when she was in town. She saw Emma Richardson running toward her with old paperwork in her hand as she closed up. "Emma!" Gasping for air, Emma called out. "This, the property documents, and the surveys must be seen." Morgan didn't simply purchase the land, he carefully considered each acre, placing it to view each of the valley's main thoroughfares. Emma whispered, as if preparing for a siege. Or, Emma suggested, someone laying a trap. Ironwood Valley went dark, but not many people slept. With their motorcycles arranged like soldiers at attention, Romano's men took up residence in the motel. Romano examined satellite photos of Morgan's ranch in his room, noting possible routes and vulnerabilities. Sterling reported, "Boss, our FBI contact came through. You won't believe what we discovered." Romano's expression darkened as he perused the file. He said, "Get everyone together. Right now." Morgan was cleaning his pistols at the ranch while sitting in the dark. Another SMS rang on the phone. "Files that were accessed. They are aware." A trace of a smile touched Morgan's lips as he erased the communications. Everything was coming together just the way he had intended. Violence was inevitable, it could not be avoided now. However, he had been taught the teachings of violence over a longer period of time than these men realized. It took us a long time to prepare and tell this story, so please subscribe to our channel if you find it entertaining, it means a lot to us. Let's return to the narrative. Carter got his own revelation by fax in the sheriff's office. He sat back and whistled gently as he read the documents. He mumbled, looking at Morgan's real identity. Son of a gun the entire time. The scene was prepared. Ironwood Valley was about to discover why some quiet men are best left alone as dawn brought with it a reckoning that had been brewing for 15 years. The pieces began to come together as Sheriff Carter sat at his desk and gazed at the fax documents strewn all around him. Not just any old cop, Ethan Morgan was a U.S. 15 years ago. Marshal Ethan Silent Storm Morgan broke up the biggest narcotics trafficking ring in the Pacific Northwest. He had lost his profession, his family, and almost his life as a result of the operation. Motorcycles thundered by the sheriff's office, shattering the morning silence. When Carter looked up, he saw phantom soldiers occupying key locations around the town. The town was being sealed down, and that was their plain message. "Sheriff, there's problems at the bank," the radio crackled. There was tension in Deputy Turner's voice. Armed, 4 of Romano's men simply entered. "I'm on my way." Carter reached for his jacket and stopped. He grabbed his cell phone and called Morgan. Morgan's quiet voice answered on the first ring, "No, already been observing. Don't participate just yet." "Don't participate? My town is being overrun by them. They believe they are." "Observe the west side of the bank." Carter walked over to his window. A familiar person on horseback approached at the corner as Romano's men and the manager came out of the bank. Morgan sat still, and the bikers froze at his very sight. Morgan's voice resounded clearly over the morning air, "That's far enough." One of the bikers snarled, but his hand shook on his rifle, "This doesn't concern you, old man." Morgan replied quietly, "Either let him go or I'll start reminding you why I was called Silent Storm." The manager of the bank's eyes grew wide. The moniker even caused a reaction among the bikers. In some quarters, Morgan's martial arts reputation was still significant. Romano clapped gently as he got out of his SUV. "It all makes sense now. The fabled Silent Storm disguised himself as a rancher. I believed you perished in the raid in Seattle." "That was what many people thought," Morgan said. "After I shut down your operation in 2008, the same individuals believed you would never rebuild." Like a lightning, the realization struck the assembling audience. Romano's face contorted with anger and recognition. "It was you who murdered my brother. When your brother decided to exploit children as drug mules, he committed suicide. Just now, I delivered the punishment." A knife could have eased the tension in the street. All of Romano's men were holding their firearms, but none of them dared to pull the trigger. All of them had heard tales of Morgan's speed and how he had gained his moniker by unexpectedly and stealthily taking out entire crews before they realized what had struck them. "Marshal, times change." Like venom, Romano spat out the title. You no longer have to deal with goons on the street. In this town, I have 30 men. There will be more soon. You are a single man. Morgan's smile was as icy as snow on a mountain. My kill box contains 30 soldiers. Since before you ever knew this valley existed, I've been setting this up. Red dots, laser sights from concealed locations, appeared on Romano's men's chests as if on cue. Morgan had been preparing for years, setting up weapons caches and cameras all around the town. Deputy Turner whispered to Carter, "Jesus." He created a trap in the entire valley. Morgan reiterated, "Leave the manager alone." We then discuss how this concludes. With perspiration on their cheeks, Romano's troops turned to confront their master. The bank manager was freed despite the chilly morning and hurried to safety. Romano growled, "This isn't over," but he was already turning to go back to his car. "You have no idea what's going to happen." "Yes, but I do," Morgan answered. "Been observing the expansion of your business. Human trafficking, gun running, and narcotics routes across Canada. Everything is documented. I'm simply waiting for you to enter my web." Romano's expression turned white. Morgan had spent 15 years constructing his business while he watched, gathered evidence, and waited for the right opportunity to present itself. Emma came out of her diner as the Phantom Reapers withdrew. All this time, she murmured as she walked up to Morgan. "You have been keeping us safe. Someone had to keep an eye on town." Morgan answered. It just seemed like an ideal location for a trap. They were joined by Sheriff Carter, who shook his head in wonder. The calm routine, the ideal location, the acquisition of the ranch. You had a strategy for it all. The best ambush is the one they voluntarily enter. Morgan got off his horse. For years, Romano has sought to grow northward. I knew he would try to set up here eventually. Valley is ideal for his business. Remote, several escape routes, and adequate movement cover. You have simply been waiting, then? Carter inquired. Assembling evidence, constructing cases, and establishing surveillance. Every inch of this valley is covered by a network of cameras. Having enough to lock him up for life after his major relocation. When is that going to happen? Morga. N followed Romano's fleeing SUV. This evening. He is too intelligent to wait and too proud to flee. He'll aim to overwhelm us with numbers and hit hard. Us? Carter's eyebrow went up. It's your call, Sheriff, your community. Fearful but resolute, Carter surveyed the expressions of his villagers. They had recently discovered that their peaceful rancher was actually a law enforcement hero who had given his all to apprehend criminals such as Romano. Carter grinned grimly, nevertheless. Let's say we should prepare then. Ironwood Valley was changed over the next few hours. Morgan oversaw the establishment of defensive positions. With monitoring monitors in the rear room displaying feeds from Morgan's covert cameras, Emma Richardson's business was transformed into a command center. While Emma's cafe served as a staging place, Dr. Bennett got his clinic ready for casualties. Morgan unlocked a secret bunker beneath his barn at his ranch, exposing a cache of tactical equipment and legal firearms. As they looked over the devices and waited for Romano to get overconfident so he could consolidate his entire operation, he informed Carter that he had been gathering evidence for 15 years. Why not simply take him into custody sooner? Required him to put in all of his effort and resources. The only method to guarantee that we receive the complete company. Morgan carefully inspected his guns. He'll try to use this town as an example tonight. Rather, he will provide us with everything we require to destroy his empire. More Phantom Reapers showed up as dusk drew near, increasing their total to almost 50. In an effort to suppress any opposition, Romano had summoned every member who was available. He was unaware that this was precisely what Morgan had anticipated. Every face was added to the evidence that would later be used to bury the entire organization, every license plate was recorded, and every arrival was photographed. Even though the storm was about to hit Ironwood Valley, Ethan, also known as Silent Storm Morgan, managed to grin for the first time in 15 years. The phantoms of his past were about to discover why certain tales never die since the trap had been set. Ironwood Valley was enveloped in darkness like a thick blanket, only sometimes illuminated by well-placed street lamps. As Romano's men positioned themselves around the town's perimeter, Morgan stood in Emma's store, examining the CCTV feeds. "As I had anticipated," Morgan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they're splitting into 4 groups." Sheriff Carter looked at his firearm. "You knew they would do that, but how?" "Since that's what I would do." Prior to going rogue, Romano was a member of the military and used a standard tactical strategy. Morgan indicated various displays. "In an attempt to push us west into their lesser teams, the main army will strike from the east." They watched as phantom soldiers moved into position through the monitors. In fact, Romano had divided his army, with 10 soldiers on each side and 20 in the main group. They moved with professionalism and coordination. With his finger tense on the trigger of his weapon, Deputy Turner questioned. "Not yet," Morgan said. "Allow them to fully embrace the strategy." Through their radios, Emma's voice crackled. They had 8 of them passing by with automatic rifles. Morgan told them to keep in mind that no one engages unless they are directly threatened. "Give them the impression that we are pinned down." A megaphone blared Romano's voice. "Morgan, your final opportunity to give up. You're besieged and outnumbered." Morgan grabbed his radio. "Oddly enough, I was going to tell you the same thing." Motorcycles and SUVs rushed into town from several areas, starting the attack. As Romano's men tried to cause confusion by shooting out lighting, gunfire broke out. They were unaware that every broken light was pushing them in the very direction Morgan desired. Morgan said, "They're in place." "It's your call, Sheriff." Carter gave a somber nod. "Turn them on." Abruptly, strong floodlights flared from hiding places, engulfing the spectral fighters in a glaring crossfire of light. Police sirens simultaneously sounded from various places, including state police in addition to Carter's deputies. Morgan had taken up his position in the nearby hills in silence. What on earth? Morgan had been listening to the Phantom Reaper's radio frequency for weeks when Sterling's voice crackled over it. "We have movement on all sides, boss." Morgan's carefully placed cars forced Romano's main force into a kill zone, leaving them stranded in the open. The initial shots were well coordinated and accurate. The defenders of the town had become an effective combat force because to Morgan's preparation. Morgan spoke calmly over the radio in groups of 3. "We practiced controlled fire and ammunition conservation." When the Phantom Reapers realized their larger numbers meant nothing, their initial attack stalled. Every path they attempted was either obstructed or imprisoned. They had previously ranged and targeted every position of cover they were looking for. Sterling was clearly in a panic, "Boss. They are dissecting us." Finally, Romano realized as he watched from his command post. He hissed, "It's a tactical funnel. Every alley, every street. For years, he has been creating this battlefield." Morgan's weapon cracked with deadly accuracy as he moved through the darkness like a phantom. With deliberate placement, each shot was meant to injure rather than kill, to disable rather than destroy. He was constructing a case and producing witnesses who would eventually testify, not merely fighting. A fresh voice roared through the night, "Federal agents. The FBI is this. There are people all around you." Helicopters appeared overhead, their headlights pinning down Romano's surviving forces, and his face turned pale. The town had not been the only target of Morgan's trap. He had meticulously timed everything by coordinating with several agencies. "Retrench," Romano said. "Pull back, everyone." But there was no turning back now. Morgan had thought of every way out. The highways were blocked by state police. Tactical FBI troops had silently encircled the location. Morgan had spent years teaching local deputies to cover even the rural roads. Morgan's voice was heard on their radio station 15 years ago. 15 years of observing you while you establish your empire, grow reckless and self-assured, and wait for you to consolidate all of your assets. Groups of Phantom Reapers started to surrender, as Emma observed from the window of her diner. It seemed almost surreal to see seasoned motorcycle riders abandoning their guns with their hands up. According to Carter, clear the south side. 7 people are being held. Another speaker confirmed that the east side was clear. 5 more were arrested. Morgan's tone did not waver. Don't forget to keep everything safe and documented. Every phone, every car, every weapon. It's all proof. Romano made one final desperate move as his situation quickly worsened. With the intention of either escaping through the countryside or exacting a last retribution, he and his core group charged for Morgan's property. Turner reported urgently that he was on his way to the ranch. Good, Morgan grinned icily. The primary evidence is kept there. Allow him to travel wherever we desire. The dark, seemingly empty property called to Romano's group like a haven. They were unaware that they were charging directly into Morgan's trap, where the most incriminating proof of the crimes committed by their group had been meticulously gathered. Emma watched in increasing awe as the procedure took place from her vantage position. We thought he was just a quiet rancher all these years, but he was building this piece by piece, she whispered to Emma. They were startled as Morgan's voice came out of the darkness. Getting ready. It's not always easy to get justice. Sometimes ripening takes time. The night had not yet ended. Despite being surrounded, Romano and his core group remained threatening. However, Morgan's face was that of a hunter whose trap had finally sprung correctly, not a man riding into peril, as he mounted his horse to face them at the ranch. The Phantom Reapers were about to discover that Morgan's previous moniker encompassed more than just his taciturn demeanor. It had to do with the unstoppable power that came after the silence. The headlights of Romano's motorcycle pierced the darkness as he and his surviving soldiers crashed through Morgan's ranch gate. A dark silhouette against the starry sky, the main house stood silent. In the distance, sirens screamed behind them. Romano gave the command, spread out, in a furious tone. Flip this place over. Look for anything that we can utilize against him. Sterling attempted to negotiate with his boss while tending to a bullet wound on his arm. While we can, we should run. The federal government supports Morgan. Morganation has proof, Romano yelled. 15 years of monitoring. There's still a possibility to salvage something, so we find it and destroy it. When they broke in, they discovered the house was empty but well kept. No personal touches, no pictures on the walls. It wasn't meant to be comfortable, it was meant to be functional. Look in the basement, Romano ordered. But as his troops approached the door, night gave way to day as floodlights outside sprang into life. Morgan's voice could be heard clearly from someplace in the darkness, which is an interesting aspect of evidence. Papers and photos are not the best kind. Testimony from living witnesses is the best kind. Romano whirled, shooting aimlessly at the voice. As Morgan's comments seemed to come from everywhere at once, his shots thudded against wooden walls. Morgan went on, your operation is already done. Your warehouses in 3 states are being raided by the FBI. The DEA is pursuing your narcotics routes. ATF is attacking your stocks of guns. Coordinated. All of this is taking place at this very moment. How? Romano's tone faltered. How did you know everything? Because I used to be you. Morgan's voice changed, bringing with it ancient hurt. Deep in a cartel, an undercover marshal. Discovered how companies like as yours think and act. Then they discovered my identity. Killed my family in front of me. Was unable to arrive in time. The realization lingered. Romano remembered now. It was the fabled operation that had destroyed the Schurz cartel. A marshal who had lost everything started it. Then Morgan stepped out of the darkness. He steadily focused his rifle on Romano. I gained patience. I saw your company emerge from the ashes of the Schurz cartel. Followed every step. Each and every link. This location was created especially to trap you. As federal officers flooded the property, Sterling and the others were already lowering their weapons and surrendering. Romano wasn't done, though. Should have stayed dead, Marshal, he growled, swiftly lifting his rifle. Morgan was quicker. Romano's gun hand was hit by his first shot, and then his shoulder. Like everything else this evening, the mafia boss's final attempt at violence failed, and he fell to the ground. An agent called from the barn, I found something. A secret elevator takes you to a command center of some sort. They were bringing up the first boxes of evidence when Sheriff Carter arrived. Morgan's patience was shadowstrated by the underground facility. Maps, records, and photographs on the walls. 15 years of carefully planned observation. Morgan walked them through the complex and stated, "We started building this place the day I bought the ranch. I knew that eventually someone would try to utilize this valley. An ideal route for trafficking in people and drugs. Simply waited for the appropriate organization to fall for the ruse." The evidence was overwhelming. Images from surveillance captured Phantom Reaper's activities in several states. Money laundering through ostensibly respectable businesses was traced using financial records. Names, times, and places. Everything required to destroy the entire organization, not just Romano's chapter. Carter shook his head in surprise. "Those cameras you put all over town. They were the last component, were they not?" Morgan agreed, "Had to record everything. Make a strong case against the Phantom Reapers as well as any dishonest government officials who assisted them and any companies that handled their money laundering." Emma showed up at the barn door with food and coffee for the police officers. The sight of the command center caused her eyes to widen. "All these years," she murmured quietly as she read your paper while eating breakfast at my cafe. Morgan said, "The best cover is a simple one, quiet rancher who doesn't talk. No one gives a man like that a lot of attention." Agents from the FBI were already examining the scene, guarding inmates, and categorizing evidence. As news broke of simultaneous raids throughout the nation, Romano sat in handcuffs, watching in real time as his empire fell apart. Morgan was told by an FBI commander, "Your old task force has been waiting for this. The prosecution will be handled by them. We're looking at charges that will lock them up for life based on this evidence." Romano was heard talking to himself by Deputy Turner, who was assisting with the processing of inmates. 15 years. He set this up for 15 years. Who does that? Morgan responded as he passed past, "Someone who knows that true justice takes time. Someone who discovered the hard way that people get killed when they rush in." The full extent of the operation became evident as morning drew near. The whole command hierarchy of the Phantom Reapers was under arrest. Their properties were taken, their assets were frozen, and their corruption was made public. Emma, who had opened her shop early to assist the law enforcement teams, brought fresh coffee with her. "After this, the town won't be the same," she said. Morgan said no. "It will be safer and better." "How about you?" Carter inquired. "Operations are finished. Are you going to stay?" Morgan surveyed the valley, which was now crowded with evidence teams and FBI cars. He had been living for this moment for 15 years, motivated by the prospect of justice and the phantoms of his past. At last, he replied, "The ranch needs to be tended. The town must be observed." In addition, a faint smile appeared on his lips. "Someone has to watch out for the next group of people who believe this valley is ready to be taken." Ironwood Valley was illuminated by a transformed vista as the sun rose over it. The Phantom Reapers were defeated. Their threat was eliminated by the patience of a man who had learned to play the long game, not only by violence. Morgan, however, realized that this was not actually the end as he saw the activity surrounding his ranch. The news of what transpired would reach other groups. Some people might be wise enough to avoid them. Morgan was okay with others viewing it as a challenge. He had patience, time, and a place that was worth defending. From whatever followed, not only the Phantom Reapers. As the next storm approached, the silent rancher would keep his watch ready. Ironwood Valley was like a community waking from a lengthy dream the morning after the invasion. Morgan's underground command center was systematically searched by FBI evidence teams, and state police handled the lengthy line of jailed Phantom Reapers. Temporary flight limitations prohibited news helicopters from flying too close. By providing law enforcement officers with meals and coffee, Emma's Diner has evolved into an unofficial command post. Everyone knew to give Morgan space, even if he was sitting at his normal booth. The air hung heavily with the weight of his revealed identity. Sheriff Carter slipped into the booth across from Morgan and stated, "Channel 7 wants an interview." Half of the national news networks also do this. Morgan studied his coffee and said he was not interested. The story is too enormous to ignore, thus there may not be any other option. In state government, law enforcement, and even the judiciary, Phantom Reapers had tentacles. Morgan gave a slow nod. The true objective was that they have corrupted everyone, not just Romano's crew. Discovered proof that a dozen police officers were employed by 3 state senators who accepted bribes. Emma went to their stand with a newspaper. "Undercover Marshal's 15-year sting operation exposes massive criminal empire," was the headline's catchphrase. She slipped the paper onto their table and remarked, "You're famous." Morgan said it makes the task more difficult. "The best work is done in the dark." Deputy Turner entered with a worried expression. "Reporters are attempting to reach Morgan's ranch, and there are more, Sheriff. The FBI recently discovered a significant piece of evidence. They require both of you." Federal agents were busy in the underground command center at the ranch. They were greeted at the door by FBI Commander Johnson. Johnson led them to a computer station and stated, "Your surveillance didn't just catch Phantom Reapers. We have proof that Romano met with Dark Riders, members of the Shadow Ravens MC, and even some representatives of the Mexican cartel." Morgan watched the video. They intended to make Ironwood Valley a significant distribution and hub for the entire Northwest. Not only that, but Johnson mentioned financial documents. Money trails lead to shell corporations and offshore accounts. This exceeds our expectations. There's a governor's office employee involved. Emma showed up at the door with an agent in tow. "I felt that everyone would benefit from some fresh coffee. And you ought to know, Morgan. Not just reporters, but outsiders are moving into the town." "Who are these strangers?" Carter inquired. "They have a military bearing, sit too erect, gaze too intently, and attempt to appear nonchalant." Morgan's face grew serious. To find out what happened to Romano, other organizations sent observers. The changes were evident around town. With the assistance of state troopers, local police had established roadblocks. In order to strengthen their case, FBI investigators interviewed residents of the communities. However, there were also more subtle alterations taking place. While federal authorities waited, Dr. Bennett attended to the wounds of a phantom warrior in handcuffs. "We assumed this was simply a small town," the motorcyclist replied softly. "A simple target. We had no idea that we were entering a trap that had been set for years." "That's what happens when you underestimate quiet men," Bennett said. Emma had to deal with an influx of customers, police, the media, and interested outsiders at the general store. She saw strangers taking notes, taking photos, and examining the town's layout. Morgan, who appeared discreetly next to her, stated, "They're already planning. Other groups believe they can succeed where Romano was unsuccessful. Will they give it a shot? Some will be wise, avoid them. The challenge will be too strong for others to ignore." The territory is too precious. Carter was distressed as he joined them. I just received word. Romano's attorney is already discussing agreements, providing names, dates, and proof of decades-old corruption. Excellent. Morgan gave a nod. We kept them alive for that reason. Men who are dead cannot testify. As the FBI examined Morgan's findings, more information came to light during the day. No one had anticipated the scope of the Phantom Reaper's operation, which had affected every sphere of society. However, Morgan had documented everything, creating a solid case that would bring down not only criminals but also those who allowed them to operate in law-abiding society. Late that afternoon, Johnson stated that he had discovered something else. Romano's correspondence with a senior feed. RAL law enforcement official who was aware of the initial operation against the Suez cartel. Morgan's expression grew stern. The one who killed my family. It appears that the leak originated inside. They were informed that you were undercover by someone. The realization struck like a punch to the body. Morgan was finally getting close to the truth about his family's murder after 15 years. As more dubious cars arrived in town, Emma observed from her diner. She told Emma, "They're like vultures, circling, waiting to see what's left." Emma answered, "They'll find more than they bargained for." Towns have changed. We are no longer a sleepy community. Morgan watched the valley from his porch as nightfall drew near. His command center had finally been processed by FBI teams. In order to enable prosecutions that would rock the foundations of multiple states, the evidence was en route to secure facilities. Carter came over with a new report. You need to see the link between federal law enforcement and this. Johnson discovered that it extends to Washington. For years, someone at the top has been guarding these operations. We now understand why Morgan remarked in a low voice. What will they do to keep it buried is the question. Few people slept that night as the sun sank over Ironwood Valley. Too much had changed. Their world had been upended by too many revelations. Morgan's 15-year probe had uncovered a network of corruption that reached the highest echelons of power in addition to a criminal empire. New players were already shifting pieces into place in the shadows. They were only one head of the Hydra, but the Phantom Reapers were defeated. Ironwood Valley was prepared for the impending larger wars. Morgan's meticulous preparation had not only resulted in the capture of criminals. It had made a fortress out of a sleepy village. Its citizens were ready for whatever that might happen next. The silent ranchers had more work to do. It was only the beginning in many respects. Morgan watched security footage of a private plane landing at the state capitol while seated in an FBI mobile command center 3 days after the raid. 3 federal justices and a Justice Department deputy director were on the passenger list. Like Morgan, Johnson thought, awful lot of firepower for a simple biker gang case. Morgan answered softly, I'm not here for the Phantom Reapers. Their purpose is to limit the harm. Romano has been conversing. In fact, Romano had begun to divulge names as soon as he became aware of the strength of the evidence against him. Federal law enforcement was rocked by his most recent comments. Agents who had steered investigations, judges who had concealed evidence, and detailed documentation of monthly payments to officials. Sheriff Carter came in with new information. State police were just told to leave the probe. The governor's office gave the order directly. Morgan nodded just as planned. In order to defend itself, power is migrating. Through Carter's radio, Emma's voice crackled. At the diner, I received 2 suits inquiring about Morgan. Even though they are wearing federal badges, something doesn't feel right. Morgan asked for a description. They have government haircuts and pricey outfits, yet their shoes are incorrect. For field work, real feds wear shoes that are functional. Morgan had already started to move. Private contractors and hired guns. They are looking for areas of pressure. The mood has shifted in town. Emma's general shop was now filled with basic survival goods and extra ammunition. Dr. Bennett had increased the emergency supplies at his clinic. Father Thomas had even allowed community defense meetings to take place in the church basement. As they drove near the diner, Carter observed that the town was adapting. "Gaining knowledge from you." "Had to," Morgan said. "I knew this would get attention once it broke. It was necessary to ensure that the community could manage it." The two suits were no longer there at the diner, but they had made an impression. Morgan received a business card from Emma. Claimed to speak for interested parties. Desired to talk about reciprocal advantages. Morgan looked at the card. Shell Corporation. "During my inquiry, I traced it. It's a cover for laundering gang funds through respectable companies." Carter scowled. "They're not even trying to hide anymore." "Not required. The system is too heavily skewed. Romano's testimony is extremely risky because of this. He is able to shadowstrate it." Johnson was back at the ranch with fresh news. "One of the offshore accounts you reported was attacked. Transfers that are directly related to your family's murder. Someone in America. The payment was approved by the marshal's office." Morgan's hands gripped his coffee cup more tightly, but his face stayed expressionless. "Who?" "Hayes, deputy director. At the time, he served as the assistant director of operations. Supervised your covert mission." Morgan felt the term as if it were a bodily blow. He had been recruited into the marshals by Hayes, who had also served as his tutor. Johnson said softly, "He's one of the ones flying in today." Emma stormed into the command center with a distressed expression. "My contact at the county records office called me just now. Morgan's property paperwork are being attempted to be removed. Searching for legal ways to take over the property." "Won't work," said Morgan. "The land is in a complicated trust. Years ago, safeguards were taken. The crisis worsened when Deputy Turner came next. Teams from the FBI are being called back to Washington. The inquiry is reportedly being consolidated, however." Morgan concluded, "But they're trying to bury it, traditional containment technique." There were more strangers in town. Men in fancy automobiles, observing, assessing. They were not like the Phantom Reapers in terms of unrefined muscle. They represented influential interests and were professionals who couldn't afford to have their connections made public. After closing her diner, Emma called a town meeting. There were a lot of worried individuals there, and they were all turning to Morgan for advice. Morgan clarified that they will attempt to isolate us. Put pressure on the town and incite conflict among the populace. Common strategies for handling witnesses. What then do we do? Dr. Bennett inquired. We remain united. Continue to collect proof. Above all, we shadowstrate to them that intimidation is ineffective. Carter tacked on his endorsement. Each deputy has received a briefing. The state police are on our side. FBI officers who refuse to give up. Morgan is no longer alone himself. Morgan received an encrypted communication from a former marshal contact as night fell. Files are being burned by Hayes. Everything related to the case of Sue Rez is vanishing. Whatever you have is causing anxiety in influential people. Morgan smiled grimly to himself. Good indicates our proximity. Johnson went over the most recent information from Morgan's monitoring. When Hayes heard of Romano's arrest, he called 3 times. One to a federal judge, one to a senator, and one to an unidentified number. Morgan stated that the crucial call was the 3rd one. That is the true force underlying it all. Look for the link. We discover who gave the order to kill my family. Emma arrived at the command center with freshly brewed coffee. The motel is being checked into by strangers. Distinct from the typical reporters. Military demeanor. Costly equipment. Morgan clarified, mercenaries. Upscale security providers. They're getting ready for a major event. Ironwood Valley kept vigilant as the night became darker. People in the town watched important positions in shifts. Because of Morgan's years of preparation, they were a community that was difficult to separate or frighten. Romano went on to discuss decades of corruption in his cell. Every new discovery increased the strain on an already precarious position. The system of power was being revealed, and it would not be overthrown easily. Morgan saw lights travel across the valley from his porch. After 15 years of patience, a system of corruption that extended to the highest echelons of government was revealed, in addition to the Phantom Reapers. That system was retaliating now. Morgan, however, had also prepared for this. Copies were given to reliable individuals, and the evidence was safeguarded. More significantly, he possessed something that the dishonest officials lacked. There were too many witnesses in the town to be silenced. Ironwood Valley would be the first battleground of the actual war, which was only getting started. With federal marshals and bodyguards at his sides, Deputy Director Marcus Hayes entered Ironwood Valley like a monarch entering his realm. In an intimidating display of force, his convoy of black SUVs parked in front of the sheriff's office. From Emma's diner, Morgan stared, his face unreadable. Just in time, he whispered. "I always enjoyed making an appearance." "Is that him?" Silently, Emma inquired. "The one who deceived you?" Morgan answered, "The one who taught me everything I know about patience, about holding out for the ideal opportunity to strike." With his pricey suit out of place among the locals, Hayes approached the diner by himself. He slid in beside his former protégé and went straight to Morgan's booth. "Black, are you still drinking your coffee?" As though he hadn't ordered Morgan's family's deaths 15 years ago, Hayes inquired. "Are you still acting like you're following the law?" Morgan quietly retorted. Hayes's smile fell short of his eyes. "Ethan, you've made quite a mess. Phantom Reapers served a purpose. Maintained certain routes open. Some individuals made payments. The system functioned. My family was killed by the system. It was essential, but regrettable. Back then, you were getting too near. Control had to be maintained." Morgan gripped his coffee cup tighter. "Came closer than you anticipated. Discovered the overseas accounts and the money trails. I found your signature, which gives the hit team permission." Hayes became a little less composed for the first time. "They destroyed those records. There are copies, such as the ones that list every bribe you've accepted and every criminal you've shielded, all securely stored in several safe places. There were more cars outside. Unmarked vans loaded with what looked like telecom equipment. Sheriff Carter was aware of the arrangement. He reported by radio that there were signal jammers. They're attempting to interrupt us." Morgan gave himself a nod. "Not going to work. Had satellite uplinks buried all across the valley. Hardened communications that are impossible to track or intercept." Hayes leaned in front. "You're fine, Ethan, just be sensible. We're my best students at all times. But you're up against forces you can't understand. Get down. The case of the Phantom Reapers should be handled internally. You still have a place in the organization. For the cartels, as there was for Romano. To look the other way, how much do they pay you? They pay for order and stability. Ethan, the world needs order. Empires are not built by clean hands. My wife and daughter were not killed by clean hands." There was steel in Morgan's voice. "You will now be held accountable for what you did." Hayes's expression stiffened. "Final opportunity. Leave now or this town will experience the true effects of pressure." The diner's power went out as if on cue. Lights flickered and died all across town. However, Morgan merely grinned. He muttered, "I forgot what you taught me. Have backup plans at all times." All around Ironwood Valley, emergency generators buzzed to life. Morgan had made arrangements for separate water and power systems as well as communications. The town is no longer defenseless, Morgan added. These folks have adjusted and learned. Quiet training and preparation for 15 years. Hayes straightened his tie and stepped up. Amazing, yet insufficient. You have backup power for hours or perhaps days. We can wait. Put you in isolation. Turn the public against you. Typical playbook. You taught me my playbook, but I've made improvements. The first altercation was already breaking out outside. When Hayes' mercenaries attempted to set up checkpoints, the townspeople began filming and photographing them from various perspectives. Evidence, Morgan clarified. An entire town's worth of witnesses cannot be eliminated by any action you take or unlawful command you issue. The voice on the radio was that of Dr. Bennett. They are attempting to gain access to medical records in order to find personal information and pressure spots. It's all fake data, Morgan said. Actual records are safe. Years have been spent getting ready for this. At dusk, Hayes' mercenaries launched their first offensive, trying to seize Morgan's property documents from Emma's shop. They encountered state police Morgan had subtly developed as supporters in addition to local cops. Sheriff Carter told them that this was still America. Legal authority and warrants are still required. Put in more effort, and it turns into a media nightmare and civil rights issue. Morgan had placed reporters he trusted all across the town. Every instance of misuse of power and intimidation was being videotaped and sent to safe places. Do you see your issue? Later that night, Morgan asked Hayes. We cannot be made to vanish. Unable to direct the story. You get deeper with each move you make. In response, Hayes dispatched his professional squads. The town's fortifications were probed by former Special Forces operators who were now employed as private contractors. They encountered opponents with comparable skill levels. Morgan's personal network of former military and law enforcement personnel. 15 years. Morgan texted Hayes to remind him. 15 years of establishing relationships and allocating resources. Did you truly believe that I was merely hiding here? As Hayes' contractors put Morgan's fortifications to the test, the night burst into short bursts of heavy gunfire. Resistance to each probing was disciplined and exact. Clear messages were sent, but no casualties. As they kept an eye on things, Johnson said to Morgan, "You got to give it to me. This entire valley has been transformed into a fortress by you." Morgan said, "Had a good teacher. I learned everything there is to know about network construction and asset placement from Hayes. He is currently being held accountable for those lessons." Emma transformed her cafe into a community command center, organizing the civilian response for the area. She stated that everyone was holding together. Nobody is crumbling under duress. Morgan clarified that this is because they are aware of the stakes. It is no longer simply about the Phantom Reapers. About resisting corruption and shadowstrating that the system isn't always successful. Hayes tried to negotiate one last time as midnight drew near. He asked Morgan to consider the collateral impact. People who are innocent could be harmed. Similar to my family. Morgan gave a chilly reply. Marcus, no. I learned patience and how to prepare for any situation from you. You will now discover what it means to confront your own strategies. One thing had been established on the first day of the siege. It would be difficult to break Ironwood Valley. Hayes had decades of experience hiding corruption, professional mercenaries, and government authority. Morgan, however, had brought something stronger. A community banded together to fight corruption, supported by 15 years of careful preparation and proof that might topple a whole organized crime network. The actual conflict was merely getting started, and both men were aware that there was only one possible outcome. Regardless of the cost, the truth has now been revealed. When dawn arrived over Ironwood Valley, Hayes' forces were putting their next phase into action. Major highways were blocked by black SUVs as groups of attorneys arrived at the courthouse bearing piles of paperwork. court reviews, property seizures, and emergency orders. As Carter and Morgan observed from Emma's store, Morgan described it as a classic pressure campaign. Strike each pressure point at the same time. Financial, legal, and psychological. Emma said, "They're freezing bank accounts," and hung up. "Everyone who has helped you, not just you. They are attempting to choke the town." In reaction, Morgan triggered plans that had been in the works for 15 years. He advised Johnson to call Angela Martinez at the Washington Post. "It's time to make package 1 available." The country was rocked by headlines in a matter of hours. Corruption in law enforcement at the highest levels. Federal authorities and illicit enterprises are linked by evidence. Selected journalists started receiving Morgan's meticulously collected documentation. Every item is timed for optimal effect. Hayes reacted quickly. Citing emergency powers, groups of federal agents attempted to take control of the sheriff's office. State police and FBI officers who were still devoted to the law approached them. Captain Reynolds of the state police firmly declared, "This is an illegal action. Here, we don't respect your authority." Emma organized the civilian reaction for the town in the diner. Hayes' people discovered a common front when they attempted to exert pressure on nearby companies. Nobody would help them in any manner, sell to them, or serve them. According to Deputy Turner, the town is not breaking. Their pressure is, if anything, strengthening people's resolve. Through surveillance footage, Morgan saw Hayes' annoyance increase. Never before had his former mentor encountered opposition this well-prepared and coordinated. Hayes' message arrived, "Ethan, and you're pressuring me. Don't force me to remove my gloves." Morgan answered, "Like you did with my family. Your worst has already happened, it was anticipated." Professional disinformation teams first used social media to disseminate falsehoods before adopting Hayes' hands-off strategy. Narratives concerning Morgan's mental health, dependability, and genuine intentions. However, Morgan had also foreseen this. He commanded Johnson to release Package 2. The media was presented with further evidence of Hayes' corruption, including video recordings of his contacts with criminal groups. The video had been collected over many years, with each clip being meticulously checked and verified. "They're backing up," Carter said as a number of Hayes' cars abruptly pulled away. "What's going on?" Johnson checked his phone and said that Internal Affairs had just begun probes in 3 government departments. Washington is in a state of disarray because to Morgan's evidence. Hayes, however, was not done. Targeting what they believed to be a weak spot close to the school, his mercenaries began their first significant investigation of the town's fortifications. Their movements were foreseen and thwarted, trapping them in pre-sighted areas of fire. As they watched the mercenaries withdraw, Morgan informed Emma that 15 years of preparation had gone into every strategy, every approach, and every tactic had been war-gamed and prepared for. National attention was being drawn to the town's united resistance. Sincere reporters started to show in, captivated by tales of a society resisting corruption. They had all they needed in Morgan's well-kept evidence. "Emma recognized that you're exposing the entire system, not just Hayes." Morgan stated that it had to be done correctly. "This level of corruption is difficult to overcome, it requires strong evidence, widespread public support, and unity." Hayes then used middlemen to his advantage, threatening and bribing important town residents. Every effort was noted, documented, and included in the expanding collection of proof. Johnson noted that they are becoming desperate and making blunders. Morgan RESP owned that they aren't ready for a whole community that has been prepared and trained for years since they're used to dealing with individuals. When Hayes' mercenaries tried to enter Morgan's ranch, the conflict intensified. In addition to local opposition, they had to contend with a group of former Special Forces personnel who had been stationed days earlier and were Morgan's personal contacts. "Do you recall the strategic depth lesson you gave me?" Morgan sent Hayes a message. "About possessing resources that your adversary is unaware of?" In response, Hayes called in additional contractors, but he was now confronted with a new issue. Overt action had been challenging due to media attention. His teams were recording, reporting, and analyzing every action they took. According to Carter, Taunt is winning the information war. Morgan explained, because we prepared for it. Everything was verified and documented. There is no way to hide it or deny it. Emma maintained a high level of morale and tight coordination by planning town meetings every evening. Support from all throughout the nation was garnered by the community's fight, which had come to represent resisting corruption. Johnson reported late that evening after receiving news from Washington. 3 senators are demanding inquiries. Hayes' supporters are beginning to turn away. From his porch, Morgan observed the valley in the decline in hostile automobiles. With his typical strategies failing against a well-prepared and cohesive society, Hayes' operation was already beginning to show signs of weakness. Next, they'll try something big, Morgan said. Hayes is not going to take loss lightly. The town is ready, Carter told him. Everybody is aware of their positions and roles. Nobody is disbanding. Hayes sent Morgan one final message as darkness fell. You may have learned too much, but you haven't seen my whole range of abilities. No, Morgan said. But I know how this ends since I've seen enough. Marcus, the truth is already known. It cannot be put back in the box. Ironwood Valley took up their guard for another night. Its citizens banded together to resist. Although Hayes had prepared for this battle for 15 years, he had never encountered an opponent who had done so. Hayes had brought everything from his corrupt playbook, including financial warfare, legal pressure, professional operators, and disinformation operations. By using his mentor's teachings against him, Morgan had established a community that was impregnable, unbreakable, and unbeatable by traditional methods. Hayes would make the next move, but for the first time in his career, he was up against an opponent who he couldn't defeat with force and corruption alone. At midnight, Hayes launched his attack, using all of his remaining resources. While legal teams sought emergency injunctions in 3 different courts, professional operators poured in from all corners. Communications and power were shut off at the same time in a planned attack that was intended to destabilize the community. Rather, they encountered a reaction that had been brewing for 15 years. As he watched from his command center, Morgan remarked softly, "Just on time. Just the way I would have arranged it." Automatic emergency systems were engaged. Critical infrastructure was powered by covert generators, while satellite communications managed to evade the attempts at blackout. Every team that approached was being followed by sensors and cameras that had been placed beforehand. According to Carter, South teams were hitting the obstacle. Heavy weaponry, professionals. Allow them to pass, Morgan said. Lead them to the exact location we desire. Hayes' mercenaries were skilled, seasoned operators who had served in the special forces. However, they were engaged in combat on ground Morgan had prepared for years. In ways too subtle to recognize, every structure and every street had been altered for defense. As the first team moved into the town center, Johnson declared, "They're in the kill zone." Devastating crossfire engulfed the mercenaries as floodlights came to life. Morgan's defenders employed rubber bullets and flashbangs instead of deadly fire, making sure that every altercation was captured on camera and recorded. Morgan clarified, "They can't say we used too much force. Everything is according to the text." Hayes watched his meticulously prepared mission unravel in his command van. At every stage, his squads reported organized resistance. They were unable to communicate. They anticipated and retaliated with their motions. "Pull back," he said. However, it was too late. Over their emergency channel, Morgan's voice could be heard. "It's time to make the last package available." At the same time, evidence started to fall across the nation. Video footage broadcasting, servers turning on, and documents being released to reporters. As 15 years of corruption started to come apart in real time, Hayes watched in horror. Johnson watched the broadcasts and exhaled, my God. You have it all. Directors of agencies, legislators, and judges. Morgan answered, had to get them all at once. They would simply reconstruct the network if you took it down completely. Emma oversaw civilian reaction teams and kept everyone safe while recording all of Hayes' force's unlawful activities. The town was now a smoothly operating machine. Everyone is aware of their part in Morgan's overall strategy. Emma stated that federal agents were coming from the north. However, these are not the same. Morgan looked at his screens. Internal Affairs, FBI. An hour ago, they received the evidence. Hayes' network of supporters is disintegrating. In a final desperate attempt, Hayes personally led a squad toward Morgan's ranch. They discovered that the approach was well lit and visible from several perspectives. You told me about fatal funnels, don't you? Morgan's voice echoed across the darkness. What about preventing your adversary from selecting the battlefield? You've ruined everything, Hayes retorted. Years of labor. Arrangements that maintained harmony. Killed innocent people to keep the peace. By allowing criminals to escape. With his weapon trained steady, Morgan stepped out of the shadows. By killing my relatives. As Hayes lifted his weapon, dozens of laser sights surrounded him. Morgan's crew was flanked by Morgan's own staff, FBI agents, and state police. Marcus, all 15 years' worth of evidence has been made public, every account has been made public, and every crime has been recorded. This cannot even be buried by your allies in Washington. When Hayes' mercenaries realized they had been set up, they started to surrender, and the combat subsided. They were experts. Professionals also know when a fight was over. Hayes made one final attempt, but you don't comprehend what you've done. There is a purpose for the system. There are more expansive views. Morgan said that justice is the only image that counts. True justice. Not the tainted version of you. Dawn discovered Ironwood Valley changed. Hayes and his remaining soldiers were arrested after FBI Internal Affairs took over. As the story spread across the country, news helicopters circled overhead. Johnson reported receiving word from Washington. In 12 federal agencies, investigations are beginning. Hearings are being called by Congress. This surpasses everyone's expectations. Morgan stood on his porch and watched as Hayes was handcuffed and taken away. Quiet preparation and patience over the past 15 years had paid off more fully than anyone could have predicted. Emma brought him coffee and added, "Town is famous now, emblem of resisting corruption. Retaliating against a dysfunctional system." Morgan answered, "Never about fame, about fairness. About shadowstrating that a single, well-prepared, and cohesive group can overcome any obstacle." Ironwood Valley was illuminated by a transformed vista as the sun rose over it. Hayes had been shown to be crooked. His network is disintegrating. More significantly, though, the town had shadowstrated that resistance was feasible. That there were weaknesses in the system. Now what? Carter joined them on the porch and inquired. Morgan observed the collection of evidence by federal officials. Townspeople are interviewed by journalists. Decades of corruption are being cleaned up by sincere officials. The real work starts now, he added softly. Rebuilding. Ensuring that this won't occur again. Seated in the rear of a government car, Hayes watched his old protege with a mix of resentment and reluctant admiration. Morgan had utterly outplayed him, turning every lesson he had imparted to his detriment. After 15 years of preparation, the peaceful rancher had turned a small community into the tool of justice. By achieving this, he had shadowstrated that even the most ingrained corruption could be defeated with perseverance, planning, and Morganation. Never again would Ironwood Valley be the same. However, that had always been Morgan's intention. When Ironwood Valley woke up the morning following Hayes' arrest, it was in the middle of a media frenzy. Reporters crowded the town and news vans lined Main Street, all attempting to put together how a quiet rancher had pulled off the largest corruption takedown in recent memory. Despite the commotion around him, Morgan appeared unaltered as he sat at his typical table at Emma's diner. He was joined by Johnson, who was carrying a large file of early reports. "It's larger than we anticipated," Johnson muttered. 27 states have opened investigations as a result of your testimony. All of the linkages and the entire crooked system are coming undone. That's the point, Morgan said, taking a drink of his coffee. Hayes couldn't just be taken out, the entire network had to be exposed. Federal agents from Morgan's command center were still analyzing evidence outside. New connections were made, new cases were opened, and new revelations were made every hour. Carter added that 7 federal judges had also been suspended. A governor is being indicted, and 4 state attorneys general are being investigated. When the reporters tried to peep through the windows, Emma shook her head and refreshed their cups. "It's hard to imagine that you planned all of this from this booth. According to Morgan, the simplest plans are the best. Wait, observe, and record everything. Until it's too late, let them believe they're safe." Emma rushed in with a newspaper in her hand. "Small town takes down corruption empire," was the headline. A 15-year operation by a former marshal reveals a national criminal network. According to her, it's the largest instance of organized corruption since the Teapot Dome affair. A secure communication from Morgan's contacts in Washington buzzed across his phone. Coming down is the first wave of indictments. The whole system of support for Hayes is breaking down. Everyone is trying to make bargains and turning on one another. Deputy Turner was working with state police at the sheriff's office to manage the flood of reporters. He informed Carter that he had received calls from 3 additional towns. "They want to know how we handled it and how we confronted them." Morgan pointed out that this is the true triumph, shadowstrating to others that it is possible and that communities can fight back if they are ready and united. The phone rang for Johnson. "You will want to see this, sir. Hayes is speaking." They watched Hayes' first FBI interview while huddled around a laptop. As he described decades of wrongdoing, the former deputy director appeared devastated, his meticulously kept facade disintegrating. Hayes stated on TV that this wasn't how it was intended to be. "We believed we could keep it under control and keep the peace with groups like the Phantom Reapers, but it outgrew us. The power was too alluring, and the money too fantastic." "What about my family?" Quietly, Morgan inquired. As though aware that Morgan would be observing, Hayes fixed his gaze on the camera. "They were only meant to frighten you away. It wasn't. I never placed an order." Morgan concluded, "But you covered it up, concealed the evidence and shielded the murderers. Because disclosure would have destroyed the entire system we had established." Morgan responded piece by piece to the screen, systems coming down anyway. As the day went on, additional information became available. Morgan's data was painstakingly compiled from patient observation over 15 years. Every illegal activity, corrupt transaction, and corrupted official has been recorded and validated. "Take a look at this." Morgan was shown a report by Johnson. Meetings between Hayes and representatives of 3 distinct cartels were captured by your monitoring. Global ramifications at this time. That night, Emma called a town meeting. As Morgan described what would happen next, the diner was crowded. He informed them that media attention would wane. "What we've begun here, however, won't. Other communities are observing and gaining knowledge. This serves as a model for resisting corruption." "Are they going to attempt to rebuild?" Carter inquired. "The dishonest networks? It won't be as simple now, but they'll try. Too many people are observing, and too many communities are prepared to oppose." Emma had more to share. "I received word from my county records office contact. Similar trends are being observed in other towns. Corruption throughout the state is being exposed thanks to your proof." Morgan gave a nod. "We documented everything for that reason. How to combat the crimes as well as the crimes themselves. How to plan, get ready, and fight back. The town had adjusted, but the media circus persisted as night fell. Emma's diner turned into a command center for answering questions from the media. In order to get advice, Dr. Bennett coordinated with other communities. A deluge of tips regarding corruption in other jurisdictions were handled by the sheriff's office. As they saw the activity, Johnson said to Morgan, "You've started something." A motion. Morgan began 15 years ago and said that it was worth waiting for and doing right in order to achieve justice. Hayes's network was disintegrating more quickly than anyone had anticipated. Dozens of officials, all eager to strike deals, expose others, and protect themselves, were implicated in his recorded confession. Morgan observed everything from the sheriff's office, his ranch porch, and the diner booth, where he usually remained silent. Nobody could have predicted the success of the man who had spent 15 years creating the ideal trap. Now what? Late that evening, as the media vehicles were finally starting to pull out, Emma asked him. Morgan surveyed his community. No longer merely a peaceful neighborhood, it is now a representation of defiance against corruption. Now, he added quietly, we help others. Show them what we have learned, including how to prepare, stand as a team, and fight back in a silent manner. Ironwood Valley's legacy was only getting started. Morgan's methodical approach has shown more than just wrongdoing. It had developed a strategy to combat it. People were discovering in places all around the nation that perseverance, planning, and Morganation could overcome even the most ingrained corruption. His community was not the only thing that had changed because of the silent rancher. He had shadowstrated that if you were prepared to wait, observe, and strike at the precise right time, justice could still be served, although slowly. Morgan addressed a crowded town hall meeting 1 week following Hayes' arrest. 12 distinct communities sent representatives to see how Ironwood Valley had succeeded where so many others had failed. It's not about firepower, Morgan clarified, his voice low enough to be heard everywhere. It involves perseverance, documentation, and creating a community that is unbreakable and unafraid. Sheriff Carter shared his viewpoint. Morgan taught us not just how to fight back, but also how to organize, collect evidence, and remain united under duress. The questions began flying in. How to spot corruption, how to record it, and how to get a community ready for the inevitable resistance. Morgan suggested starting small. Observe, document everything, and gradually create trustworthy networks. Above all, realize that short-term successes are not long-term ones. Emma oversaw an expanding intercommunal information exchange network at the diner. She informed Morgan that 3 additional communities had received reports of dishonest officials attempting to halt investigations, but that they were now prepared to use your strategies. Johnson came from Washington with new information. Hayes' admission sparked a chain of events, and federal task groups were established in response to your testimony. They are referring to it as the FBI's largest anti-corruption operation ever. Morgan said, and the international connections. Interpol is now involved. Meetings between Hayes employees and cartel leaders in 6 different nations were captured by your monitoring, exposing entire networks. Emma's store has evolved into an unofficial educational hub, shadowstrating preparation and organization to neighboring communities. She told a delegation of visiting town officials that it's not simply about retaliating. The goal is to create something that corruption cannot destroy. Morgan observed the changes as he strolled down Main Street. There was now a purpose where there had been terror at the advent of the Phantom Reapers. Ironwood Valley was no longer merely a town. It served as a representation of opposition to structural corruption. Do you need to see something? He was summoned to the sheriff's office by Carter. Do you recall the offshore accounts you monitored? Hayes was not the only one they produced. We are examining corruption in government contracts, large financial organizations, and even military purchases. Morgan examined the data. They will attempt to conceal it. Too many influential people were involved. I'm already trying, Johnson said. However, your distribution system was flawless. Journalists and investigators throughout the world are examining the evidence. This genie cannot be placed back in the bottle. At his clinic, Dr. Bennett reported more activity. Community organizers, not patients, are learning how to create safe networks for communication. He informed Morgan that they were building their own resistance networks by copying your strategies. Good, Morgan said. The system is only effective if it spreads. People can fight back if they learn. Emma planned daily briefings for community leaders and visiting officials. She clarified that Morgan's plan involved more than simply eliminating Hayes and the Phantom Reapers. It was about making a model that other people could use. The effects extended outside of the United States. Morgan's evidence has shown transcontinental networks of corruption. Investigators from several nations flocked to Ironwood Valley to examine how a single little community managed to do what billion-dollar organizations were unable to. Everything was captured by your surveillance, an Interpol agent informed Morgan. Every encounter, every deal, every relationship, years of endurance, and the creation of a strong case. Morgan stated that it had to be thorough. This level of corruption is resistant to swift attacks. It must be demolished piece by piece using unburiable and indisputable evidence. Emma discovered Morgan examining news of other communities starting to fight corruption at his customary booth late one evening. You've shown people that it's possible to fight back, she remarked. Hope is insufficient, Morgan said. Strategy, patience, and unity are required. We are able to teach them that. The community adjusted to its new function. Emma's diner was transformed into a community organizing classroom. Other law enforcement received evidence-gathering training from the sheriff's office. Meetings on creating networks of community resistance were also held at the local church. Carter said he received word from the governor's office. The state is forming a task force to combat corruption. Do you want to use this as the base? Take a lesson from our mistakes. Morgan thought about it. Might work. Town has the experience and is already prepared for training, but it must be done correctly. No shortcuts. Johnson returned from Washington with fresh news. Hearings before Congress begin next week. Campaign funding, banking laws, law enforcement monitoring, and significant reform initiatives are all being influenced by your evidence. Morgan agreed and said, reform is good, but the real change occurs at the community level. People are learning to unite, withstand pressure, and combat corruption in a non-intrusive manner. Morgan watched the valley from his ranch porch as twilight descended. The town's lights were twinkling, but now they had a new meaning. Each one served as a symbol of resistance against corruption in addition to being a place of residence. When Emma delivered his evening coffee, he informed her that he never imagined it would get this far. All I wanted was justice for my family. She answered, became something bigger, turned into a concern for universal justice. Though not the aggressive kind his enemies had feared, the peaceful rancher had begun a movement. Rather, he had developed a model for methodical, patient opposition against corruption. People all around the nation were discovering that they didn't require a lot of money or weapons. They required morganation, planning, and the forbearance to wait until the ideal opportunity. Ironwood Valley has fully transitioned from target to teacher. The village that had assisted in overthrowing an empire of corruption was now teaching others how to stop such empires from resurrecting. Morgan's act of retaliation had evolved into something more, a legacy of defiance and hope that would endure beyond any one triumph. Morgan got the paperwork he had been waiting for 15 years 2 weeks after Hayes was arrested. In Emma's diner, Johnson gave it to him directly. The full inquiry into the murder of his family, eventually made public. They located them, Johnson muttered. The real hit squad. Hayes's admission brought us to them. Forgetting his coffee, Morgan gently opened the file. He remembered the faces peering back at him from that night 15 years ago, though they were older now. Through a string of shell corporations that ultimately linked back to Hayes, 3 men, former special forces, were hired. Are they being held? Morgan's voice hardly made a sound. They're speaking and verifying everything when I picked them up this morning. Hayes planned the entire cover-up in addition to ordering the hit. From behind her counter, Emma observed Morgan going over the file. She noticed a tiny relaxation in his shoulders, as though a weight had been lifted, for the first time in 15 years. Got more, Johnson added. Do you recall the offshore accounts you monitored? Led to a network of shadow banks and large financial institutions that launder money for criminal groups all over the world. Carter came with more news. Next week, the first significant case will go to trial. Hayes was charged with corruption along with 32 other federal officials. Your proof is flawless. In the weeks following the altercation, the town had changed. Morgan's techniques for collecting and preserving evidence were taught to other law enforcement agencies at a training center that was now headquartered in the sheriff's office. Community organizers were learning how to create resistance networks at Emma's business. Emma informed Morgan that 4 other villages reported success this week. Expose dishonest authorities using your techniques. Just patience and documentation, no conflict, no aggression. Communities in 3 states were connected by a secure communication network that Dr. Bennett had set up. He said it's spreading. People are discovering that corruption is not a given. As usual, Morgan read his paper and drank coffee in the mornings. Now, however, he also examined reports from other communities that used his model. Every success story revealed a new flaw in the crooked system he had assisted in exposing. Johnson informed him that tomorrow is the first day of congressional hearings. Significant banking reform laws and effective anti-corruption actions are being prompted by your evidence. More significantly, communities are learning to unite, Emma continued. Ironwood Valley is now a blueprint rather than only a tale. The global ramifications kept getting worse. Morgan had tracked money flows for 15 years, and Interpol investigations had spread to 12 nations. After decades of operating with impunity, criminal networks were now vulnerable and exposed. Morgan was told by an Interpol inspector, "Your patience was extraordinary. Most individuals would have hurried and attempted to exact swift retribution. You created a scheme that took down whole networks." Morgan's response was typical. Real justice is not always the same as speedy justice. Morgan drove to the state prison, where the men responsible for his family's deaths were being kept, late that afternoon. He sat in his truck and observed the walls without entering. Do you not want to confront them? Concerned, Carter followed and inquired. Morgan said, I already did. 15 years of planning this every day. They are no longer significant. Making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else is what counts. Emma had planned another training session for visiting community leaders while she was back in town. She added that Morgan shown to us that violence is not necessary for opposition. It requires patience, documentation, and unity. The proof that Morgan had collected kept coming in. There were criminal probes into major banking organizations. As corruption ties were exposed, political careers came to an end. Most significantly, however, communities discovered that they could defend themselves. Johnson said that evening that he had received word from Washington. 15 cities are establishing new anti-corruption task forces based on your concept. Community coordination, thorough documentation, and patient observation. As he watched the sunset from his ranch porch, Morgan nodded. Silently, Hayes continued, I think he's teaching me about power, taught me a lot about patience and waiting for the ideal opportunity to reveal everything. Emma relayed news of 2 more towns successfully fending off pressure, 3 more crooked networks being exposed, and more victories. Morgan's strategies were working incredibly well when used correctly. He told a group of visiting officials that unity is the key. Corrupt systems separate and isolate. They cannot destroy a community that is united, ready, and patient. Morgan went to the little memorial he had erected behind his home as night fell over Ironwood Valley. His wife and daughter's graves were marked by 2 plain stones. These were not their actual graves, but rather a location he had made to honor them. "Done," he whispered to them. "Something more significant, something that could help prevent it from happening again, not just justice for you." Later, Emma discovered him there and handed him his coffee for the evening. "Will you testify at their trial, the men who killed them?" she said softly. "No need to," said Morgan, shaking his head. "It's always better when the evidence speaks for itself." Beyond retaliation, the silent rancher had discovered something. His legacy of standing up to corruption would endure beyond any one-off triumph. Communities all around the nation were realizing that they had the ability to take a stand, fight back, and effect change. Ironwood Valley was no longer merely a town that had triumphed over corruption. It had turned into a sign of hope, evidence that even the most powerful criminal networks might be overthrown by persistent, well-organized resistance. There was much more to Morgan's 15-year wait than just retaliation. It had paved the path for others and established a model for combating corruption that anybody might use. It was not only his own story that the quiet rancher had altered. For innumerable others who would never know his name, he had altered the conclusion. The federal court complex located in Washington, D.C. With its marble columns shining in the morning light, it stood as a monument to justice. No longer the quiet rancher, Morgan ascended the stairs as a crucial witness in what was being dubbed the corruption trial of the century. "Are you prepared for this?" Johnson walked next to him and inquired. "I've been prepared for 15 years, Morgan said quietly. The courtroom was crowded inside. Despite his jail uniform, Hayes continued to attempt to maintain his power as he sat at the defense table. He glanced at Morgan for a moment before averting his gaze. Morgan's painstaking documenting of 15 years of misconduct was the first piece of evidence the prosecutor presented. Financial documents, surveillance images, and video recordings were all meticulously collected and stored. The prosecution spoke to him. "Mr. Morgan, could you please tell the court how you obtained this evidence?" Morgan provided accurate, thorough, and scathing testimony. He explained the corruption network piece by piece, shadowstating how Hayes had created a system that eliminated risks while shielding crooks. "What about your family?" the prosecutor asked softly. Morgan answered steadily, "They died because I got too close to the truth. I began organizing, observing, and compiling unburyable and indisputable evidence since Hayes ordered it to be covered up and shielded the murderers." In Emma's diner, a screen was placed up for the town of Ironwood Valley to observe the proceedings. They witnessed their quiet rancher revealing the reality that had influenced the change in their neighborhood. During a pause in testimony, Emma said the international task force has grown once more. Morgan's findings exposed banking systems, government officials, law enforcement, and corruption networks in 15 nations to far. Carter provided an update of his own. This week, Morgan's techniques were effectively applied in 4 additional towns, exposing corruption, bringing their people together, and resisting pressure. Days passed during the trial. Hayes's defense team attempted to portray Morgan as untrustworthy and obsessed, but the evidence was too strong. Every recording was authenticated, every document was checked, and every connection was shadowstated. The prosecutor contended that the defendant did more than simply taint the system. Until one man made the decision to spend 15 years obtaining the truth, he became the system. Johnson updated Morgan on the international probe during a recess. Major financial institutions and government officials in Europe and Asia were linked by Interpol. Your documentation approach is quickly taking the lead in anti-corruption investigations across the globe. Emma had converted her diner into a permanent gathering spot for neighborhood organizers who were studying Morgan's techniques. She told a group, "It's not simply about collecting evidence. The goal is to create communities that are impervious to division and intimidation." The growing network of resistant communities has been successful, according to Dr. Bennett. During a nighttime call, he informed Morgan that his template was effective. community cohesion, thorough record-keeping, and patient observation. Corruption is powerless to stop it. Hayes eventually crumbled under cross-examination after returning to court. "You don't get it," he yelled at Morgan. "The system required structure and management. Chaos is the result of your approach." "No," said Morgan coolly. "Justice, real justice, not the crooked kind you were peddling, comes my way." Morgan's collected evidence kept coming back to him. Money laundering allegations were brought against major banks. As corruption ties were exposed, political careers came to an end. Most significantly, however, communities discovered that they could defend themselves. By publicly establishing its training center, Ironwood Valley was instructing other towns on how to apply Morgan's techniques. For law enforcement agencies looking to effectively combat corruption, the sheriff's office became a model. Johnson reported receiving queries from 3 additional countries. They want to know how you organize your community and how you document things. You've produced a universally useful product. Morgan read about other communities that had successfully resisted corruption on his ranch porch in the evenings. Every triumph signified an additional weakness in the structure he had assisted in revealing. One evening, he told Emma, "I never imagined it would go this far. All I wanted was justice for my family." She answered, "Became something bigger, turned into a concern for universal justice." The trial's influence extended outside of the courtroom. Congress used Morgan's testimony to start enacting significant reforms. His techniques for looking into corruption were adopted by international organizations. People all throughout the world discovered that they could resist corrupt authority. One morning, Johnson announced the last prosecution witness. "The men who murdered your family are being brought in. They will verify Hayes' directives." Morgan gave a slow nod. Testimony is not as important as evidence. It always has. The quiet rancher had built more than a profitable business. He had created a model for combating corruption that anybody might use. Unity, documentation, and patience. Communities discovered that they only needed preparedness and resolve, not conflict or violence. Emma said she had better success. Untrustworthy networks are made public. Communities together. The silent means of delivering justice. Morgan's strategies worked incredibly well when used correctly. He told visiting officials that unity is the key. Corrupt systems separate and isolate. The community that is patient, prepared, and united. They are unable to shatter that. Morgan went back to Ironwood Valley as the trial came to a close. The town had evolved, become more resilient, and emerged as a symbol of defiance against corruption. However, its heart and sense of belonging had been preserved. "What follows the verdict?" Carter questioned him. From the porch of his property, Morgan observed the sunset. "Continue teaching and assisting others in rising to their feet. Just because Hayes goes down doesn't mean the work is done." Beyond self-justice, the quiet rancher had discovered something. He had left a legacy of defiance that would endure beyond any one triumph. Globally, communities were realizing they had the ability to resist and bring about change. Ironwood Valley was no longer merely a town that had triumphed over corruption. It had turned into a ray of hope, shadowstating that even the most established criminal networks might be overthrown by persistent, well-organized resistance. Morgan had gained something far more important than retribution during his 15-year wait. It had paved the path for others and established a strategy for combating corruption that anybody could use. It was a calm Tuesday morning when the verdict was rendered. Morgan watched the courthouse feed on a laptop while seated in his normal booth at Emma's diner. The jury had spent less than 6 hours deliberating. Marcus Hayes is found guilty on all counts by the jury. 15 years of patience and meticulous preparation had culminated in this moment, as the words reverberated throughout the cafe where the entire town had assembled to witness. As the judge read out the sentencing, Hayes stood resolutely. Multiple life sentences with no chance of release. Emma quietly refilled Morgan's coffee and stated, "It's done." Morgan retorted that there was still work to be done. Johnson came with the latest information from the global probe. Currently, Interpol operates in 20 nations. No one was aware of the corruption networks that your evidence revealed. Law enforcement, government representatives, and banking systems are all falling. The week earlier, the individuals who killed Morgan's family had already received their sentences. Morgan had not been present at their sentencing, but their evidence regarding Hayes's directives had been scathing. The evidence was self-evident. Emma showed Morgan the most recent information and revealed that 4 additional corrupt networks were exposed this week. When individuals know how to resist, communities that use your tactics and stand together are powerless to stop it. Ironwood Valley had accepted its new duty wholeheartedly. The sheriff's office provided law enforcement organizations with ongoing training sessions. Morgan's methods were taught to community organizers at Emma's diner. Even the neighborhood church has evolved into a gathering spot for organizations training to create networks of resistance. Carter informed Morgan that he had received requests from 6 additional nations. They want to know how you organize your community and how you document things. You have produced a worldwide work of art. News of the growing network of resistant villages was relayed by Dr. Bennett. He clarified, "Your template works everywhere. It cannot be resisted by meticulous documentation, community cohesion, patient observation, or corruption." Morgan read about other communities successfully retaliating on his ranch porch in the evenings. Every triumph signified an additional weakness in the structure he had assisted in revealing. Johnson stated that your tactics and facts played a major role in Congress passing the new anti-corruption bill. This time, there will be true reform with real enforcement authority. For the visiting community leaders, Emma had planned an additional training session. She added that Morgan shown to us that violence is not necessary for opposition. It requires patience, documentation, and unity. The impact on a global scale kept expanding. Money laundering allegations were brought against major banking firms. As corruption ties were exposed, political careers came to an end. Most significantly, however, communities discovered how to effectively defend themselves. Carter said he had received word from Washington. Based on your idea, new anti-corruption task forces are currently being formed in 30 cities. Community coordination, thorough documentation, and patient observation. Morgan nodded as he observed the sunset from his preferred location. Silently, Hayes continued, "I think he's teaching me about power, taught me a lot about patience and waiting for the ideal opportunity to reveal everything." Emma relayed news of 6 more towns successfully fending off pressure, 5 more crooked networks being exposed, and more victories. Morgan's strategies were working incredibly well when used correctly. He told a group of visiting officials that unity is the key. Corrupt systems separate and isolate. They cannot destroy a community that is united, ready, and patient. Morgan went to the little memorial behind his house late that night. The stones that marked the remembrance of his wife and daughter appeared to have changed. More about legacy, less about loss. "It's more than we anticipated," he said quietly to them. "Grew into something greater, something that may help prevent others from experiencing it." Emma discovered him there and provided his coffee for the evening. According to her, the movement is expanding more quickly than anyone anticipated. Globally, communities are learning to take a stance and fight back. Morgan answered, "Because they were ready." All that was requi. Red was a method that worked and the knowledge that it was feasible. The quiet rancher had built more than a profitable business. He had created a model for combating corruption that anybody might use. Unity, documentation, and patience. Communities discovered that they only needed preparedness and resolve, not conflict or violence. Ironwood Valley was no longer merely a town that had triumphed over corruption. It had turned into a ray of hope, shadowstrating that even the most powerful criminal networks might be overthrown by persistent, well-organized resistance. Morgan observed his town's lights as night fell over the valley. Each one stood for more than simply a house. it was a symbol of defiance against corruption. Something considerably more significant than retribution had come from his 15-year wait. It had paved the path for others and established a strategy for combating corruption that anybody could use. Now what? Carter joined him on the porch and inquired. Morgan researched the community he had assisted in transforming from a possible victim to a symbol of resistance in the valley he had selected 15 years prior. Just keep teaching, he added. Continue assisting others in getting to their feet. Although the work is never truly done, individuals are increasingly aware of how to defend themselves in a peaceful manner. It was not only his own story that the quiet rancher had altered. He had altered the course of events for innumerable others who would follow his lead and confront corruption within their own societies. With every new triumph and every community that learned to unite, the legacy would endure and only get stronger. More than any one victory, Morgan had given them something. He had provided them with hope and the means to realize it. Ironwood Valley had become comfortable in its new role 6 months after Hayes was sentenced. While somehow retaining its small-town charm, the sleepy ranching community has evolved into a global training ground for anti-corruption initiatives. Even while Morgan continued to get his morning coffee at Emma's Cafe, he now shared his booth with world-renowned community leaders, imparting to them the patience and accuracy that had brought down Hayes' network. He told a group of South Americans that documentation is your weapon. Every encounter, every deal, every relationship. Develop the evidence gradually and methodically. Make denial impossible. Emma added her own advice as she refreshed their mugs. Evidence, however, is insufficient. The community must unite. That's what we learned from Morgan. Corruption is weaker than unity. Johnson showed up with the most recent data. In the last 6 months, 217 corrupt officials have been indicted. 43 criminal networks were revealed. Morgan, all employing your strategies. Community coordination, thorough documentation, and patient observation. Morgan's surveillance methods were taught to law enforcement agencies in a special training wing that was added to the sheriff's office. Carter directly oversaw the program. He said that he now has agencies from 30 different countries. The lesson is the same for all of them. When communities know how to combat corruption, it can no longer exist. Emma's shop had developed into a training ground for civilian resistance. She trained other community organizers in network building, secure communication, and pressure response coordination. Morgan told her most recent class that her approach is effective because it is straightforward. Watch, record, and come together. No conflict, no violence. Just organized, patient resistance. Reports from the growing network of resistant communities were delivered by Dr. Bennett. He told Morgan that the patterns were always the same. Corruption is defeated when people realize they can effectively defend themselves. The impact on a global scale kept expanding. Morgan's findings had spurred international investigations, revealed decades of corruption, and showed that, with community support, no network was too large to fail. Over coffee in the evening, Johnson mentioned an intriguing development in Europe. Following the application of your techniques by communities to expose money laundering and the propagation of patterns, 3 large banks were charged with crimes. Morgan continued to maintain his peaceful demeanor and his keen awareness of his surroundings while spending more time educating and imparting the knowledge he had gained during his 15-year operation. He told a group of community leaders that patience is the key. Corrupt systems anticipate fierce opposition and fast responses. They have no idea how to combat communities that observe, record, and wait for everything. In order to accommodate training sessions, Emma had added a meeting room to her cafe. She explained that Morgan shadowstrated to us that resistance does not require guns. Time, paperwork, and unity are required. Its effects go beyond conventional corruption. Communities gain the ability to recognize and oppose all types of systemic abuse. Morgan's strategies worked well against organized crime, business exploitation, and political corruption. Carter reported that he received word from Washington. 12 states have passed new laws based on your approach. Legal foundation for neighborhood-based anti-corruption initiatives. As he watched the sun set from his ranch porch, Morgan nodded. He added softly, never about changing laws, about empowering communities with effective tools to combat corruption. More success tales were brought by Emma. 10 villages have successfully resisted coercion, while 8 corrupt networks have been revealed. Every triumph expanded upon Morgan's model while preserving its fundamental ideas and tailoring it to local requirements. Johnson said the movement is now self-sustaining. Communities educating one another. The network is getting stronger every day. Morgan went to his family's memorial late that night. These days, the stones seemed to be more about change than loss. He whispered to them that it had grown beyond retaliation. Became about teaching others how to avoid the same fate that befell us. Emma discovered him there and provided his coffee for the evening. Ironwood Valley isn't the only place you've transformed, she remarked. Altered the way that corruption is combated worldwide. Morgan answered that they were always prepared to fight. I simply had to know how. Had to see that it was feasible. What the humble rancher had produced would endure beyond any one triumph. His strategies were successful, therefore they spread. Because they provided communities with actual authority to combat corruption. Although Ironwood Valley was still his home, its impact was felt all across the world. New accounts of communities banding together, exposing corruption, and refusing to be bullied or divided emerged every day. Carter joined Morgan on his porch and asked, "What's next?" Morgan observed his town's lights, each of which stood for more than simply a house. It was a symbol of defiance against corruption. His 15-year pursuit of justice has grown into a global movement for reform. Just keep teaching, he added. Continue assisting others in getting to their feet. Although the work is never done, they are now capable of fighting. The silent route. The legacy would keep expanding, moving from one town to another, shadowstrating that even the most ingrained corruption could be overthrown by persistent, well-organized resistance. They had gained something from Morgan that was worth more than any one win. He had provided them with a path forward, an effective strategy, and an enduring hope. His story was not the only thing that the quiet rancher had altered. He had left a legacy that would endure long after he had won his personal battle by altering the way communities around the world resisted corruption. Morgan was reading international reports in his usual booth at Emma's diner 1 year to the day after Hayes' imprisonment. His techniques have helped communities uncover corruption in 37 nations. There was no indication that the silent revolution he had initiated would slow down. Emma brought his coffee and remarked, "It's hard to believe it's been a year. At times, it seems like yesterday that we were concerned about the arrival of the Phantom Reapers." Morgan studied a South American report and nodded. Town and Brazil discovered corruption up to the governor's office by using our procedures. Just patience and documentation, no conflict, no aggression. Johnson showed up with the most recent data. This year alone, 342 corrupt officials were indicted. 67 criminal networks were made public. Morgan, they're all utilizing your template. The quiet route is now the norm. The sheriff's office had become a global training facility. Carter oversaw law enforcement organizations as they learned Morgan's methods of surveillance and constructing unburyable and undeniable cases. Carter reported receiving a request from Interpol. Their goal is to establish your documentation techniques as the benchmark for anti-corruption investigations worldwide. Patterns that spread more quickly than anyone anticipated. Community organizers from all over the world were being trained in civilian resistance at Emma's store. It was always the same teachings. Unity, documentation, and patience. She told her most recent class that corrupt governments are incapable of defeating communities that unite. They anticipate violence and the breaking of people under duress. For organized patient resistance, they are unprepared. Dr. Bennett presented updates from the growing network of communities that are resisting. Although your techniques have been modified for various contexts and cultures, the fundamental ideas have not changed. Watch, record, and come together. The effects go beyond conventional corruption. Communities gain the ability to recognize and oppose all types of systemic abuse. Morgan's strategies worked well against organized crime, business exploitation, and political corruption. Johnson said, "I got something interesting from Europe. There, communities exposed corruption in large financial organizations using your techniques. Began with local observation and progressed to global research." Morgan continued to maintain his peaceful demeanor and his keen awareness of his surroundings while spending more time educating and imparting the knowledge he had gained during his 15-year operation. To a gathering of leaders, he explained, "The key is changing how communities think about resistance, not about quick victories, but about patient, organized response that corrupt systems can't fight." Emma had converted her diner into a meeting spot for neighborhood organizers who were studying Morgan's techniques. "He shadowstrated to us that violence is not the path to true change," she said. "It results from patience and unity." Morgan went to his family's memorial late that night. Like the legacy he had created, the stones held strong despite having endured a year of seasons. He whispered to them that it had evolved into something more than retaliation. "Became concerned with keeping others from experiencing what happened to us." When Emma discovered him there, she brought news of other victories, including the exposure of 12 corrupt networks and the successful resistance of 15 villages to pressure. Every triumph expanded upon his model, tailoring it to regional requirements while upholding its fundamental ideas. She noted that the movement is now self-sustaining. Communities are educating one another, and the network is becoming stronger every day. Morgan nodded as he observed the valley turning yellow as the sun sank. Giving people useful tools is more important than focusing on a single person or town. Carter brought news from Washington back to the diner. "A congressional committee wants to include your techniques in the curriculum for law enforcement officers. Describe it as the best anti-corruption initiative they have ever seen." Morgan clarified that it operates from the ground up. The battle must be led by communities. People are standing together, but law enforcement is also supporting. The distinction lies in that. Johnson presented information from throughout the world. "The results of your evidence are still coming in. This month, 3 additional significant investigations were started. Patterns are consistent. Patient observation that results in indisputable evidence." Morgan reflected on the years since Hayes' imprisonment while sitting on his ranch porch as dusk descended over Ironwood Valley. His pursuit of justice had developed into something much more than a desire for vengeance. When Emma delivered his evening coffee, he informed her that he never imagined it would get this far. "Began with wanting to put things right. Changed the way corruption is combated globally," she said. "For a quiet rancher, not terrible." Ironwood Valley was no longer merely a town that had triumphed over corruption. It had evolved into a beacon of hope and a test site for effective strategies. A training ground where communities can learn to unite. Morgan's legacy would keep expanding as it moved from one town to another, shadowstrating that even the most ingrained corruption could be overthrown by persistent, well-organized resistance. More than any one win, he had given them something. He had provided a path for them to follow. His story was not the only thing that the quiet rancher had altered. He had left a legacy that would endure long after he had won his personal battle by altering the way communities around the world resisted corruption. Morgan gave himself permission to smile a little as he looked out over his valley. Below, the lights of Ironwood Valley glowed, each one symbolizing not only a house but also a place of defiance against corruption. Something considerably more significant than retribution had come from his 15-year wait. Communities all around the world had been given hope, and more significantly, they had been equipped with the means to realize that hope. 5 years after Hayes' conviction, the warning arrived on a calm Tuesday morning. Morgan's techniques had been used to assault 3 training facilities in various nations. Expert operators had delivered a strong message, intimidated witnesses, and destroyed evidence. There was no way the old guard was going down easily. Over coffee in the morning at Emma's, Johnson informed Morgan that they were changing. These were not typical crooks who learned to thwart our strategies. They were experts, most likely former intelligence officers. Morgan took a close look at the reports. In an attempt to disrupt the line of evidence that we utilize to reveal corruption, they are focusing on the documentation. Emma called an urgent gathering of local officials and shuttered the diner early that night. Through a secure video link, representatives from the targeted centers shared their stories. According to a Singaporean trainer, they were familiar with our protocols. Knew just how to interfere with our operations and where to strike us. Someone is researching us and discovering our shortcomings. Carter had more alarming information. Interpol informed me. Similar trends have been seen in 12 nations, with coordinated attacks against anti-corruption organizations that consistently target our techniques for acquiring evidence. Morgan's countenance was contemplative as he watched the attack tape. They are committing the same error as Hayes, believing that if they undermine the system, the resistance will also be undermined. However, Emma added, they don't comprehend. This isn't made possible by the system. The communities themselves are the problem. Morgan instantly started to modify his approach. He imparted knowledge to the following generation on how to establish redundant documentation networks, decentralize the collection of evidence, and safeguard witnesses through community action as opposed to official security. He told his students that they couldn't fight what they couldn't find. There being no central area to target, every home becomes a potential evidence storage facility, and every member of the community becomes a documenter. It was an impressive response. Morgan's new protocols were adopted by communities all across the world. Evidence could not be destroyed or suppressed because it was stored and shared among thousands of individual citizens. A week later, Johnson remarked, "I got something interesting." In fact, the attacks increased community involvement. Now, those who were on the fence are joining in. They wish to assist after recognizing the danger. This tendency was confirmed by Dr. Bennett. The entire neighborhood reacted as they stormed the Singapore Center. Everyone began to record, document, and share information, transforming their entire community into a single, massive evidence collection operation. Morgan understood and nodded. They have yet to grasp it. Attacking computers or buildings won't stop corruption from being exposed. Actual abilities within the populace. Emma continued her documentation efforts while planning additional training sessions to teach communities self-defense techniques. According to her, Morgan's strategies are effective because they are flexible. We change more quickly than they can stop us. In an attempt to stop the movement at its origin, the assailants then targeted Ironwood Valley. They were up against a community that had learned from all the attacks before. With satisfaction, Carter remarked, "I walked right into it." Dozens of folks recorded every action they took. Before they even completed their mission, their faces, their cars, and their procedures were all recorded and disseminated globally. From his ranch, Morgan observed the arrest of the professional hit team. Another piece of proof against corruption was the result of their highly skilled attack. Later, he informed Emma, they never learn. Continue to believe that they can use force to combat this. Ignore the fact that patient resistance always prevails. The impact of the strikes was unforeseen. Morgan's strategies gained much more traction. Communities came to understand that violent reactions to anti-corruption initiatives shadowstrated their efficacy. Dozens of new documentation networks were produced by each attack. Johnson revealed that he received reports from 30 new locations that will open next month. Communities no longer have to wait for training. They are independently putting the protocols into practice and modifying them to suit regional requirements. Morgan's silent revolution had reached an invincible level. Suppression efforts simply served to increase its resilience, strength, and distribution. He told a fresh batch of leaders that's the true power of community. You can't scare everyone. You can't keep a whole town quiet. more people rise up to be counted the more they fight it. Ironwood Valley served as a living example of this idea. Every citizen became a defender of justice and truth as a result of the abortive attack, which further strengthened communal ties. That night, Morgan gave himself permission to smile a little as he looked out over his valley. The lesson he had learned 15 years ago was still not clear to them. True strength came from steady, concerted opposition that was unbreakable, not from force or violence. With each assault, the calm rancher's creation became more powerful. As his strategies changed and evolved, they would continue to expand, shadowstrating to communities all across the world that they could defeat corruption. Although the battle had not ended, its fate was now certain. Those who relied on force and fear would always be defeated by the strength of united communities, armed with patience and truth. Morgan witnessed the terrible success of his developed techniques being IED by a global network of communities 3 months after the failed attacks. Their greatest strength had become the very strategies that had been employed against them. Johnson showed Morgan the most recent reports and remarked, "Very impressive adaptation." To record the monitoring being used against them, communities are utilizing their own surveillance. Every effort to hide evidence results in the creation of fresh evidence. International opposition actions were now coordinated out of Emma's diner. Globally, community leaders supported each other's documentation networks, exchanged information, and modified strategies. During the morning briefing, Emma revealed that Seoul had just uncovered another corruption ring. Utilize the disseminated evidence technique you created following the assaults. Every citizen started to watch. Since there was no central location to target, it was impossible to shut it down. Morgan looked at recent operation footage and nodded. They're picking things up quickly. Every community enhances the approach and offers something fresh. The system continues to grow stronger. Law enforcement networks provided the news that Carter presented. I received confirmation. Last month, 3 significant criminal syndicates attempted to break into community defense networks. They were all made public and recorded. Your new procedures were a huge success. Morgan's techniques had revolutionized anti-corruption initiatives. Communities no longer depended on official security or centralized evidence storage. Each citizen joined a natural defensive system. Morgan told a fresh group of trainers that the secret was to comprehend their strategies. They anticipated discovering targets to assault. Rather, they discovered whole communities banding together against them. You can't use force to combat that. Dr. Bennett gave his students examples from medicine. He compared it to an immune system. The resistance gets stronger the more they attack. Every community gains knowledge, adjusts, and becomes more resilient. The impact on a global scale beyond all expectations. Criminal groups were exposed to a level never seen before. Every attempt to hide evidence just led to more resistance, more witnesses, and more documentation. Johnson said, I got something interesting from Europe. Last week, 3 syndicate leaders surrendered themselves in. Said that it could no longer be operated. Too many people are observing and documenting everything. Even Morgan hadn't entirely expected the way his modest revolution had developed. Communities were fighting corruption in more ways than one. They were deliberately searching for it, exposing it, and preventing it from functioning. Emma noted at an evening strategy session, this is new. We are no longer merely protecting. Corruption is being actively sought out, documented, and shared across boundaries by communities. Morgan's strategies have been elaborated upon by the leaders of the following generation. The strength of documented resistance and patient observation was instilled in young people. Emma mentioned that she had received information from 50 new communities that were establishing documentation networks. They are no longer awaiting training. They are improving the protocols and putting them into practice independently. From his property, Morgan observed how his legacy expanded beyond his wildest dreams. The peaceful rancher's tactics had developed into a global movement that was unstoppable by corrupt authorities. During their nightly debrief, he informed Carter that they still didn't understand. A complete community that has learned to stand together cannot be intimidated by your continued use of force and threats. The evidence was self-evident. After decades of operating with impunity, criminal groups were revealed and decimated. When the community came together to oppose, corruption that had been impenetrable fell apart. Interpol provided updated numbers, Johnson said. In documented neighborhoods, organized criminal revenue has decreased by 60%. When everyone is observing and recording, they are unable to continue operating. The change was striking. Using Morgan's developed techniques, communities that had previously lived in fear came together to defend themselves and reveal corruption at all levels. Morgan told visiting authorities that this is the sign of true transformation. Preventing corruption from functioning at all, not just combating it. 3 months after the unsuccessful attacks, Emma planned a party. Community leaders were gathered in the diner, sharing success stories, modifying strategies, and fortifying networks. Emma informed the audience that they believed they could use force to stop us. Rather, they strengthened, adapted, enhanced, and further united us. From his typical booth, Morgan observed how his life's work progressed beyond his initial idea. Because corrupt forces were unable to comprehend the quiet rancher's patient resistance, it had developed into a movement that they were powerless to stop. That night, Morgan saw more than his town when he looked out over Ironwood Valley. He saw a representation of what could be accomplished by communities who stood united, observed with patience, and refused to be frightened. Morgan was reading the morning paper in his usual booth at Emma's Cafe 10 years after the Phantom Reapers rode into Ironwood Valley. He looked at the headline. Corruption rates fell to all-time lows. Morgan is credited with bringing about global change. Black, are you still drinking your coffee? Emma slid into the booth opposite him and inquired. Her eyes still gleamed with the same resolve from 10 years earlier, but her hair had turned completely silver. Morgan said quietly, "Some things don't change," and then he nodded to the page. "Certain things do." Carrying his last report prior his retirement, Johnson joined them. "I have the most recent numbers. More than 5,000 communities around the world are utilizing your techniques. Corruption can no longer flourish. Too many individuals standing together, documenting, and observing." The diner, which is now a historic place where people come to learn about the quiet revolution that transformed the globe, caught Morgan's attention. After 15 years of planning, the booth had come to represent patient resistance. "Do you recall when we believed it was solely about the Phantom Reapers?" Emma brought fresh coffee and inquired. "I never thought it would get this bad." Carter came from Washington with news. "Your tactics are becoming codified into international law. The Morgan Protocols are the accepted norm for global anti-corruption initiatives." Morgan's focus, however, was on a young girl who was there with her parents at the diner. She was reading a chapter about Ironwood Valley and the peaceful revolution from a school textbook. "That's important," he remarked quietly. "The next generation is growing up understanding how to combat corruption and how to stand up to it." Dr. Bennett presented findings from a worldwide investigation. Communities that use your techniques exhibit whole change, not only improved collaboration, stronger social links, reduced corruption, and genuine democratic participation. There was no denying the evidence. Morgan's methodical approach has altered more than just the way corruption was combated. It had altered the way communities operated. Johnson pulled out a final report and said, "I have something you should see. Do you recall the children who were raised here when the Phantom Reapers episode occurred? They currently spearhead anti-corruption initiatives in 30 nations." Morgan nodded, recalling the arduous path from personal suffering to global transformation. His pursuit of justice had developed into something far more than retaliation. He said to Carter, "Take me up to the ranch." A final glimpse of the valley. Perched on his porch, Morgan looked out over the property that had been his observation post for so long. Below, Ironwood Valley expanded into a live representation of defiance against corruption rather than merely a community. Emma joined him in saying, "You found more than justice. You discovered a method to keep others from experiencing what happened to your family." Morgan recalled the night the Phantom Reapers had entered his trap without realizing they had contributed to a worldwide revolution as he caressed the weathered wood of his porch railing. Morgan thought, "Hayes believed he was teaching me about power. Taught me a lot about patience and waiting for the ideal opportunity to make a big shift." Emma brought the success stories for the day. Unity triumphs over intimidation, hundreds of villages remain strong, and corruption is revealed and stopped. She grinned, the quiet way. As it happens, it was always the strongest option. Morgan made one final trip to his family's memorial as the valley was turned gold by sunset. Like the legacy they had inspired, the stones held strong after having endured 10 seasons. "It's more than we imagined," he whispered to them. "Evolved into a tool that benefits everyone, everywhere." Morgan saw more than his town as he took one last look over Ironwood Valley. He could see the future that his patience had created. People standing together, communities unified against corruption, and truth triumphing over power. His story was not the only thing that the quiet rancher had altered. He had established a legacy that would shield future generations by altering the way the world combated corruption. Now what? Standing next to him, Carter posed the question. Morgan saw his town's lights, each of which stood for more than just a house. They were also symbols of defiance against corruption. He had waited patiently for something far more essential than retribution. He added softly, "Now we let them carry it forward. The next generation is already aware of what needs to be done, how to unite, and how to combat corruption in a non-violent manner." With every town that learned to stand together, the heritage would endure and become stronger. Every individual who opted for patience instead of violence. Every win was achieved by meticulous documentation and unwavering solidarity. Ironwood Valley would continue to serve as a symbol, but the true triumph was achieved by communities all around the world learning how to defend themselves, unite, and combat corruption without turning corrupt themselves. Morgan's transformation from grieving father and husband to force for change in the world was complete. By transforming personal misery into universal optimism, he shadowstrated to the world that power and violence were not the most effective ways to combat corruption. It was perseverance, solidarity, and the silent power of people standing up for what's right. The light Morgan had ignited would continue to spread, shadowstrating to communities worldwide that they had the strength to stand up, to resist, to win the quiet way, even as the sun set on Ironwood Valley for the final time. 2 more amazing tales await you directly on your screen in the next section. You won't want to miss these if you liked this one. Simply click to view, and remember to subscribe. A lot would be at stake.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.